17 powerful families destroyed, daughters disgraced, sons dead in the woods, fortunes burned to the ground. And at the center of it all, a slave. He never carried a weapon. He never led a rebellion. He barely even spoke. But wherever he appeared, marriages collapsed, men grew violent, and entire bloodlines turned against each other. They called him cursed. They called him a seducer. They called him the most dangerous man in the South. But what if he never did anything at all? What if the real destruction began inside the hearts of the powerful who couldn't stand what they saw when they looked at him? This is the dark, forgotten history of the most handsome slave blamed for destroying 17 families, and the truth is far more terrifying than the legend. History remembers kings. It remembers conquerors. It remembers tyrants and revolutionaries. But it rarely remembers the beautiful. And yet, in the fading records of the late 18th century, buried in letters and burned estate logs, there is mention of a man whose face alone was said to ruin households, collapse fortunes, and stain 17 family names in scandal and blood. His name was Elias. No last name was ever recorded. Slaves were not given that dignity. But in whispers across the southern territories of colonial America, Elias became something more than a slave. He became a curse. He was born in chains in 1763 on a plantation outside Charleston, in what was then the province of South Carolina. The plantation owner, a wealthy tobacco merchant named Edmund Whitmore, first noticed the boy's unusual appearance when he was only 12. Even under the harsh sun and dust of the fields, Elias's features seemed almost unreal. His skin was a warm bronze, his eyes a startling pale hazel, and his bone structure sharp and symmetrical in a way that seemed sculpted rather than born. It was whispered among the enslaved that his mother had once been a house servant taken advantage of by a European trader passing through Charleston harbor. No one could prove it. No one dared speak it loudly. But Elias did not resemble the others entirely, and that difference would shape the darkness that followed him. By 16, he no longer worked in the fields. Whitmore brought him into the main house. Officially, Elias became a personal attendant. Unofficially, he became a display. Guests at Whitmore's estate would comment on the exotic beauty of the young man as if he were a rare painting or sculpture. Visitors from Boston, London, and even France during the final years before the American Revolution would stare too long. Wives would grow quiet. Daughters would blush. Husbands would stiffen with suspicion. In a time when power was everything and ownership defined status, Whitmore paraded Elias subtly, positioning him behind chairs, pouring wine, lighting candles. His silence made him mysterious. His eyes made him unforgettable. The first family to fall was not Whitmore's. It was the Ashcrofts. The Ashcroft estate bordered Whitmore's land. Their eldest daughter, Margaret Ashcroft, was 19 when she first saw Elias during a dinner gathering meant to strengthen alliances between plantation families. Margaret had been promised to a distant cousin, a respectable but uninspiring match arranged to preserve land holdings. But during that dinner, she could not look away from the silent attendant refilling her glass. Elias never spoke. He simply met her gaze once. That single glance was enough. Within weeks, Margaret began sneaking notes through one of the kitchen servants. She would walk near the property line at dusk, pretending to gather wildflowers. The meetings were brief and dangerous. Elias knew the cost of being discovered. Margaret knew the cost of disgrace. Desire in that era was not simply scandalous. It was deadly. When Margaret's father discovered a folded scrap of parchment hidden inside her prayer book, he did not rage publicly. Instead, he acted quietly. Elias was accused of attempted theft and whipped publicly as punishment, though no evidence was ever presented. Margaret was locked inside her room for months. But punishment did not end it. It intensified it. Margaret refused to marry her cousin. The engagement dissolved, bringing humiliation to the Ashcroft name. Rumors spread that she had been touched or influenced. No one dared say by whom. Within a year, the Ashcroft patriarch suffered a stroke during a heated dispute over land rights. The family's holdings were divided among distant relatives. Margaret was sent north to live with an aunt in Virginia. The Ashcroft fortune fractured. and whispers began. They did not blame Margaret. They blamed Elias. On plantations and in town markets, the story twisted. Some said Elias bewitched her. Others said his mother practiced dark rituals. A preacher traveling through Charleston even warned during a sermon that temptation often wore a beautiful face. Whitmore found the rumors amusing at first. Attention increased his status. His gatherings grew larger. More families requested invitations. Everyone wanted to see the slave who had nearly ruined the Ashcrofts. Elias became an unspoken attraction. But fascination breeds jealousy, and jealousy breeds violence. The second family to fracture was the Beaumonts. Their matriarch, a sharp-eyed widow named Clarissa Beaumont, visited Whitmore frequently under the guise of discussing trade routes. She was known for her intelligence and iron composure. No scandal had ever touched her name, until Elias. Unlike Margaret, Clarissa did not pass notes. She did not sneak through gardens. She simply summoned Whitmore for private meetings more frequently, insisting Elias serve wine personally. Servants began noticing the prolonged silences in drawing rooms. Whitmore began noticing the way Clarissa's visits lingered past sunset. Then one night, a confrontation erupted. Clarissa's eldest son accused Whitmore publicly of dishonoring his mother. Pistols were drawn. Though no shots were fired that evening, the social rift was permanent. Trade agreements between the Beaumonts and Whitmore collapsed. Court cases followed, draining both estates of money. Clarissa withdrew from society entirely. Two families destabilized. And still, Elias remained silent. He never defended himself, never denied anything, never confirmed anything. Some said that was his power. By 1782, the Revolutionary War had reshaped the colonies, but plantation society clung tightly to its hierarchy. In a world built on ownership and control, the idea that a man with no legal rights could influence powerful households was intolerable. So the narrative darkened. Elias was no longer described as handsome. He was described as dangerous. A visiting minister declared him a serpent in human form. A rival plantation owner claimed livestock died after Elias walked past their fields. Children were warned not to look into his eyes. Fear is easier to spread than truth. The third family to collapse was not through romance but suspicion. The Caldwell household accused Elias of manipulating their youngest daughter after she refused to eat and withdrew from social events. Though there was no evidence they had ever spoken, Elias was blamed for her melancholy. The Caldwell patriarch demanded Whitmore sell him or remove him. Whitmore refused. That refusal deepened resentment. By now, at least 5 prominent households had either severed ties with Whitmore or faced internal fractures tied, however loosely, to Elias's presence. Financial disputes became personal. Personal disputes became violent. Lawsuits piled up. One duel resulted in a fatal wound. Each time Elias was nearby, not acting, not speaking, simply existing. And that was what terrified them most. Because in a rigid world of power and control, how could a slave, a man without property, without title, without legal standing, unravel families without lifting a hand? Some historians argue it was projection. That plantation society, already rotting under greed and hypocrisy, simply needed a symbol to blame. Others suggest Elias understood more than he showed, that he used silence strategically, that he allowed infatuations to grow just enough to expose cracks already present in marriages built on arrangement rather than love. By the winter of 1785, the count of disrupted families had reached 7. But the worst was yet to come, because eventually, the destruction would circle back to the Whitmore estate itself. And when it did, blood would stain the polished floors that once displayed him like art. 17 families would not fall because of beauty alone. They would fall because desire, power, jealousy, and fear are far more dangerous than chains. And Elias was about to learn that being admired can be deadlier than being invisible. By the spring of 1786, Elias was no longer simply a curiosity. He had become a threat, not because he carried weapons, not because he plotted rebellion, but because powerful men began to feel something they could not control: insecurity. and insecurity, when wrapped in pride, becomes violence. The Whitmore estate, once admired as one of the most stable plantations outside Charleston, had grown strangely divided. Servants whispered more cautiously. Guests visited less frequently. Invitations from neighboring estates declined one by one. Those who still came did not laugh as loudly as before. They watched. They watched their wives. They watched their daughters. They watched Elias. Edmund Whitmore prided himself on his rationality. He dismissed superstition publicly. He mocked the idea that a slave could possess mystical influence. Yet even he could not ignore the tension that tightened the air whenever Elias entered a room. It was not merely attraction. It was disruption. Conversations shifted. Attention drifted. Silence stretched. And in that silence, doubt began to breed. The eighth family to fracture was the Harringtons, wealthy rice growers with deep political ties in post-revolution South Carolina. Their patriarch, Thomas Harrington, was a man obsessed with legacy. He had survived the war financially intact and intended to strengthen his influence further through strategic marriages and trade alliances. He visited Whitmore one humid evening in July with his wife and their twin daughters, Eliza and Catherine, both 18 and newly introduced into society. The dinner began politely. Trade was discussed, crop yields compared, politics cautiously mentioned. But by dessert, something shifted. Elias was instructed to serve wine. It was Eliza who stared first, not with childish curiosity, but with quiet fascination. Catherine followed her sister's gaze. Soon both were studying him openly, whispering to each other. Their mother noticed, then their father. Harrington's jaw tightened. He forced a laugh and made a remark about Whitmore's ornamental help. But the humor did not reach his eyes. The next week, Harrington forbade his daughters from attending any further gatherings at Whitmore's estate. He accelerated marriage negotiations with two distant cousins from Savannah. The twins protested loudly. For the first time in their lives, they resisted. What began as stubbornness escalated into rebellion. Eliza refused meals. Catherine wrote letters she would not allow her parents to read. One night, the sisters disappeared from their rooms for nearly 3 hours. They were later found walking near the property border dividing Harrington and Whitmore land. They claimed they were only talking, with whom no one would admit. Harrington did not seek clarification. He sought blame. He stormed onto Whitmore's property the following morning, demanding Elias be flogged or sold. Whitmore refused, insulted by the accusation. The confrontation ended with threats of legal retaliation. Within months, the Harrington estate faced internal collapse. The marriage arrangements dissolved after rumors of the daughter's impropriety spread. Potential suitors withdrew. Investors hesitated. Harrington, consumed by paranoia, accused his own overseer of conspiring against him. He dismissed loyal staff. Productivity dropped sharply. Then, during a private hunting excursion, Thomas Harrington suffered a fatal accidental gunshot wound. Officially, it was misfire. Unofficially, whispers claimed his eldest farmhand had grown tired of his erratic rage. The Harrington daughters were sent north to relatives. The estate was divided. 8 families fractured. But this time there was blood. The death changed the tone of the rumors. Elias was no longer described as merely seductive or cursed. He was now called an omen. Charleston society, already tense in the fragile post-war years, began circulating more dramatic interpretations. Some claimed Elias had learned manipulation from foreign sailors in Charleston harbor. Others insisted he was fathered by nobility and carried some unnatural charisma in his bloodline. A traveling pamphleteer even described him as a man who unmans men without touching them. Fear, once whispered, now traveled faster. The 9th and 10th families fell almost simultaneously. The Rutherford household accused Whitmore of intentionally using Elias to destabilize neighboring estates to gain economic advantage. Trade relationships disintegrated. Lawsuits were filed. The Rutherfords' eldest son challenged Whitmore's nephew to a duel over an insult regarding household purity. The nephew survived. The Rutherford heir did not. Meanwhile, the Bellamy estate collapsed under scandal when Mrs. Bellamy's correspondence with an unnamed E. was discovered by her husband. Though there was no evidence the letters were addressed to Elias specifically, the implication was enough. Mr. Bellamy publicly denounced Whitmore and withdrew from all shared business ventures. Months later, creditors seized portions of the Bellamy property due to poor financial management following the scandal. 10 families, and Elias had still not spoken in his defense. Not once. Some began to wonder whether his silence was intentional strategy. Silence allows others to project their fears. Silence forces imaginations to fill gaps. Silence in a rigid society can feel like defiance. Yet those who worked closest to him noticed something different. They noticed fatigue. Elias slept less, ate little. His once steady hands occasionally trembled while pouring wine. He avoided prolonged eye contact, not out of shame but caution. He had learned something crucial. People were not falling because he pursued them. They were falling because they could not accept their own desires. And so they needed a villain. By late 1787, the Whitmore estate itself began to strain. Edmund Whitmore's wife, Anne Whitmore, had long tolerated her husband's decision to display Elias prominently. She had considered it harmless vanity. But as reputations crumbled and threats increased, her patience dissolved, and confronted Edmund privately, accusing him of prioritizing pride over safety. She warned that society was turning hostile. She demanded Elias be sold south, far from Charleston influence. Edmund refused again, not out of kindness, out of ego. Selling Elias would feel like surrender. And Edmund Whitmore did not surrender. But Anne Whitmore was not content with refusal. Shortly after Christmas that year, a fire broke out in one of the secondary storage buildings on the Whitmore estate. The blaze was contained, but investigators quietly noted the smell of lamp oil near Elias's quarters. No evidence proved arson, but suspicion shifted inward. For the first time, Elias was confined to his sleeping quarters at night under guard. Trust had eroded completely. The 11th family to shatter was the Whitmores themselves. And Whitmore began spreading subtle remarks during church gatherings, implying that Elias's presence invited divine punishment. She framed it as moral concern. She encouraged other women to consider how easily temptation infiltrated households. Her words were strategic. Within weeks, invitations ceased entirely. The Whitmore estate, once vibrant with guests, grew isolated. Trade slowed dramatically. Edmund found himself negotiating smaller contracts at lower profits. Financial pressure mounted. Arguments between Edmund and Anne became public. Servants overheard shouting late into the night. One evening, a porcelain vase shattered against a wall during a confrontation over Elias's continued presence. Then came the turning point. In early 1788, Anne Whitmore was found unconscious at the base of the main staircase. Her neck was broken. Officially, it was ruled a fall. But Charleston society did not believe in coincidence anymore. Some whispered that Edmund pushed her in anger. Others whispered that she discovered something and was silenced. A darker rumor claimed she confronted Elias directly and something terrible occurred in that confrontation. No one could prove anything. And Whitmore's death sent shockwaves through the remaining allied families. Fear hardened into hatred. By now, 11 families had suffered scandal, financial ruin, death, or permanent division in some way connected, directly or indirectly, to Elias. The remaining prominent households convened privately in Charleston. They did not invite Whitmore. They discussed preservation. They discussed reputation. And finally, they discussed removal. A coordinated effort began to pressure Whitmore economically. Credit lines were restricted. Shipping agreements delayed. Political allies distanced themselves. Whitmore's stubborn refusal to remove Elias was interpreted as arrogance. Under mounting debt, Edmund finally faltered. In the autumn of 1788, he agreed to sell Elias. But not locally. He arranged for Elias to be transported inland, to a remote plantation near the Carolina backcountry, owned by a reclusive landholder who rarely engaged in coastal society. The sale was executed quietly at dawn. No public farewell. No final confrontation. Elias was shackled once more, after years inside the main house, and placed into a covered wagon. As he left the Whitmore estate, he did not look back. Some say he felt relief. Others say he understood that exile would not end the destruction. Because the problem had never been location. It had been perception. And perception travels faster than chains. The moment Elias arrived at the backcountry plantation, the rumors arrived with him. He was introduced not as a worker, but as the man who ruined 11 families. Fear greeted him before his name did. And fear, when planted in isolation, grows far more violently. The next 6 families would not fall through romance or scandal. They would fall through something far darker. Violence would no longer be whispered. It would be deliberate. And this time, Elias would not remain untouched by it. When Elias arrived in the Carolina backcountry in late 1788, the land felt different from Charleston. There were no polished floors, no elegant dinner parties, no silk gowns brushing against mahogany tables. The plantation was isolated, carved roughly from forest and swamp, owned by a man who valued silence more than society. His name was Silas Mercer. Mercer had little interest in coastal politics. He had survived the Revolutionary War by avoiding entanglement and mistrusting everyone equally. He did not attend social gatherings. He did not involve himself in trade disputes. His estate was smaller than Whitmore's, but it was disciplined, rigid, controlled. When Elias was brought before him in chains, Mercer studied him for a long time without speaking. Mercer had heard the rumors. Everyone had. But Mercer did not believe in curses. He believed in leverage. If beauty unsettles men, Mercer reportedly muttered, then men are weaker than they pretend. He purchased Elias not for display, but for labor. For the first time in years, Elias returned to the fields. The sun burned harsher in the backcountry. The soil was less forgiving. The overseer, a former soldier named Jacob Pryor, did not care for whispers of scandal. Pryor cared for productivity. Elias was treated like any other enslaved worker, no better, no worse. And yet the rumors followed him like shadow. The enslaved community on Mercer's land had heard fragments of the story before Elias even arrived. They had heard of duels, of ruined daughters, of broken marriages, of fires and falls down staircases. They had heard that powerful families trembled at the sight of him. To them, Elias was not cursed. He was proof that the powerful were fragile. That frightened some of them. It inspired others. Within weeks of his arrival, something subtle began to shift. Not in romance, not in flirtation, but in confidence. Elias worked steadily, silently, as he always had. Yet other enslaved men began standing. Straighter in the fields when overseers barked commands. Women began holding eye contact longer when spoken down to. A strange undercurrent of defiance, small but noticeable, moved through the labor lines. Mercer noticed. He did not blame Elias at first, but Pryor did. Pryor had built his authority on intimidation. When workers obeyed out of fear, his position felt secure. But when they obeyed without visible fear, something inside him recoiled. He began watching Elias, noticing how others gravitated near him during short breaks. Noticing how disputes among workers were often brought quietly to Elias for mediation, even though he had no official role. Elias never encouraged rebellion. He never spoke openly against Mercer. But his very presence seemed to challenge the unspoken rule that power must always look confident. And Pryor despised that. The 12th family to fall was the Mercer household itself. It began with Mercer's youngest son, Daniel Mercer, a boy of 17 who idolized control the way his father did. Daniel had grown up believing strength meant domination. He frequently visited the fields to observe the workers, mimicking Pryor's stern posture. One afternoon, Daniel confronted Elias directly. Witnesses later recounted that Daniel accused him of spreading silent poison among the workers. Elias reportedly replied only once. He said, "Men fear what they cannot own." It was the first recorded sentence Elias had spoken publicly since leaving Whitmore's estate. Daniel struck him across the face. The blow was not severe, but it was witnessed, and something changed. That night, Daniel insisted on personally supervising a punishment demonstration meant to reassert authority. 2 workers were whipped publicly for minor infractions. The spectacle was excessive, theatrical. But fear did not return the way Daniel expected. Instead, resentment deepened. Weeks later, Daniel Mercer disappeared during a routine patrol along the tree line. His horse returned rider. Without him, the search lasted 3 days. Mercer organized armed patrols. Pryor interrogated every enslaved worker individually, sometimes violently. The surrounding woods were combed, the swamps dragged, neighboring settlements questioned. Daniel's body was eventually found near a shallow ravine, partially concealed by brush. His skull had been fractured by blunt force. There were no clear signs of robbery. His pistol remained holstered. His boots were intact. It did not look like bandits. It looked personal. Mercer did not allow a public investigation. He declared it an accident, a fall from horseback. But he did not believe it, and neither did Pryor. Suspicion descended like a storm cloud. It did not matter that no one had seen Elias near the ravine that day. It did not matter that Daniel had enemies beyond the fields. In Mercer's mind, the pattern was undeniable. Families fractured. Sons died. Households destabilized. Elias had arrived. And within months, his own son was dead. The 12th family was marked by grief and paranoia. Mercer withdrew from daily operations. He began drinking heavily. Pryor, fueled by anger, intensified punishments across the plantation. Work hours increased. Food rations decreased. Surveillance tightened. Oppression grew heavier. And with it, resistance grew quieter but sharper. Elias did not speak again publicly. But something about him had shifted. Daniel's slap had left a faint scar near his cheekbone. The mark became symbolic among the workers, not as humiliation, but as evidence that even the powerful needed to strike to feel secure. Pryor began crafting a narrative. He told Mercer that Elias was not just a disruptive presence, he was strategic, that he provoked emotional instability in households intentionally, that he used silence as manipulation, that Daniel's death was orchestrated to send a message. Mercer, drowning in grief, listened. Soon, Elias was removed from the fields and confined to a storage outbuilding at night, under heavy guard. By day, he was forced into isolation tasks, repairing fences alone, hauling water without interaction, cleaning tools under supervision. Isolation was meant to break influence, but isolation can also deepen legend. The surrounding backcountry families began hearing about Daniel Mercer's death. The old Charleston rumors merged with this new tragedy. Now Elias was not merely associated with scandal and financial ruin. He was linked to murder. The 13th family to collapse was not even directly connected to Mercer's land. The Holloway family, small-scale farmers several miles away, had a daughter engaged to Daniel Mercer. When news of his death reached them, they publicly blamed Mercer's dangerous purchase. They claimed Daniel had been drawn into darkness by harboring a man whispered to be cursed. Their accusations escalated into legal complaints and public denouncements at church gatherings. The Holloways demanded Elias be executed. Mercer refused, not out of mercy, but pride. To execute Elias would mean admitting fear, and Mercer could not admit that. The Holloways retaliated by severing trade ties and spreading even more dramatic rumors, claiming livestock miscarried after Elias stepped onto Mercer land. They claimed children woke screaming after hearing his name mentioned. The hysteria infected nearby settlements. Within a year, the Holloway patriarch died suddenly of fever. Their crops failed due to poor rotation practices neglected during months of obsession with rumor campaigns. Debts mounted. The Holloway estate fractured under financial pressure. 13 families. The pattern felt supernatural to those who believed in patterns. But the reality was far more human. Grief, jealousy, pride, projection. Each collapse had roots far deeper than Elias. Yet he became the lightning rod. The 14th family fell through violence born of suspicion. Jacob Pryor, increasingly unstable, convinced Mercer to allow a private interrogation of Elias. The interrogation was not meant to gather truth. It was meant to extract confession, to confirm the narrative Pryor had already constructed in his mind. In a dim storage shed lit by a single lantern, Pryor accused Elias of orchestrating Daniel's death. He accused him of poisoning minds, of inciting rebellion without speaking, of destroying families deliberately. Elias denied nothing, but he did not confess either. He said only, "You fear your own reflection." That sentence ignited Pryor's rage. The beating that followed was brutal. Mercer did not witness it directly, but he heard it, and he did not stop it. Elias survived, though barely. Word of the beating spread quickly among the workers. Anger simmered beneath forced obedience. Weeks later, Pryor was found stabbed near the tool shed at dawn. The weapon was a simple farming blade. No one confessed. No one was seen. But everyone understood that the plantation had crossed into something irreversible. Mercer panicked. Now it was not merely rumor. It was open bloodshed. He blamed Elias again. The official report sent quietly to neighboring landowners described Pryor's death as an act of collective unrest triggered by the influence of a singular destabilizing presence. 14 families now connected by threads of fear and violence. The 15th collapse came through internal fracture. Mercer's eldest daughter, Abigail Mercer, who had remained distant from plantation operations, began questioning her father's decisions openly after Pryor's death. She argued that escalating brutality had created the unrest. She insisted Elias was a scapegoat. Her stance shocked Mercer. For the first time, dissent existed inside his own home. Arguments erupted nightly. Abigail threatened to leave the estate entirely. She wrote letters to distant relatives criticizing her father's management. The Mercer name, once respected for stoic control, became associated with chaos. Abigail eventually departed for relatives in Georgia, severing ties permanently. Mercer lost his son to death, his daughter to ideology, his overseer to violence. The 15th family fractured not through scandal, but through division of belief. The 16th fall was quieter, but darker. An elderly neighboring planter named Amos Klein had long prided himself on rationality. He mocked superstition publicly. Yet after visiting Mercer and seeing Elias in chains, something unsettled him. Klein returned home withdrawn. He began accusing his own household staff of conspiracy. He dismissed long-trusted workers. He claimed invisible tensions lurked in his halls. His paranoia grew until he alienated his business partners and mismanaged crop sales disastrously. Klein died alone 2 winters later, his estate deeply in debt. 16 families. And Elias was still alive. By 1790, the backcountry plantation felt less like farmland and more like a pressure chamber. Mercer aged rapidly. His hair grayed within months. His posture bent. He avoided looking at Elias directly, because deep down, a terrifying realization had begun to form. Elias had never plotted. He had never seduced deliberately. He had never organized rebellion. All he had done was exist in a world built on fragile pride. And pride, when cracked, destroys itself. The 17th and final collapse would not come from rumor. It would come from choice. Mercer, exhausted and financially strained, received an offer from a distant trader to purchase Elias for transport south, possibly to the Caribbean sugar colonies where survival rates were brutal. Selling him would end the local legend. It would remove the symbol. It would restore order. Mercer summoned Elias one final time. For the first time since Daniel's death, they spoke alone. Mercer demanded to know what Elias wanted. Freedom? Revenge? Confession? Elias, weakened but steady, reportedly answered with a calm that unsettled Mercer more than anger ever could. "I want nothing from you," he said. "You have destroyed yourselves." Those words broke something inside Mercer, because he knew they were true. Every family had fallen through its own weakness, jealousy, ego, fear, cruelty. Elias had been the mirror, and men who cannot bear mirrors smash them. That night, Mercer made a decision. Instead of selling Elias south, he staged an escape. Officially, Elias fled into the forest. Privately, Mercer had him escorted beyond county lines and released under condition of disappearance. Mercer hoped that removing the symbol would end the curse. But symbols, once created, do not vanish easily. Mercer's estate never recovered financially. Within 5 years, large portions were sold to settle debts. He died reclusive, remembered less as a strong planter and more as the man whose land became infamous. The 17th family fell quietly into obscurity. And Elias? No confirmed record exists after his disappearance. Some claimed he traveled north and passed as free. Some claimed he died in the swamps. Some insisted he reinvented himself under another name, carrying with him the strange legacy of 17 shattered households. What remains certain is this: no document ever proved he committed violence. No record showed he orchestrated rebellion. No confession tied him to a single deliberate act of destruction. Yet 17 families fell in the shadow of his presence. History calls him a destabilizer. Folklore calls him cursed. But perhaps the truth is darker. Perhaps Elias was simply a man born beautiful in a world that feared anything it could not dominate. And in that fear, powerful men destroyed themselves. When Elias disappeared into the forests beyond Mercer's land in the early 1790s, most believed the nightmare had finally ended. There was no body, no capture notice, no auction record, no transport log bearing his name. Officially, he had fled. Unofficially, he had become something far more powerful than a man. He had become a story, and stories, unlike flesh, do not die easily. In the years following his disappearance, the backcountry quieted. Mercer's estate slowly fractured into smaller parcels of land, sold piece by piece to settle debt. The overseer's shed where Pryor had died was torn down. Daniel Mercer's name faded from church sermons. The Holloway farm changed ownership. The Klein estate dissolved into distant relatives' hands. But the whispers did not fade. They spread. Travelers carried fragments of the tale to neighboring territories, Georgia, North Carolina, even into Virginia. The details shifted with each retelling. In some versions, Elias seduced plantation wives with a single glance. In others, he incited violent uprisings without speaking a word. In darker retellings, he was said to possess unnatural knowledge of men's fears, exposing secrets simply by standing near them. The story transformed with distance. By the late 1790s, Elias was no longer described as a former slave. He was described as a phantom. The 18th century was drawing to a close, and the young United States was reshaping itself. But in the rural South, hierarchy remained rigid. Reputation was currency. Honor was survival. And the idea that a man born enslaved could shatter powerful families had left a psychological wound. To admit the families destroyed themselves would require accountability. Blaming Elias was easier. The first resurgence of his legend came in 1798 in a small settlement near the Savannah River. A planter named Robert Halden accused one of his enslaved workers of carrying the same eyes as the man from the Mercer lands. Halden's wife had been found exchanging quiet conversations with that worker near the well. No scandal had yet erupted, but Halden reacted with immediate violence. He ordered the worker sold south within days. The speed of his reaction was not rooted in proof. It was rooted in fear. Fear that history might repeat itself. Within months, Halden's marriage collapsed anyway, not because of the worker, but because mistrust had already infected the household. His wife left for her brother's estate. Halden's business partnerships suffered as rumors spread that he had lost control of his home. Neighbors began whispering again. They said Elias's spirit traveled through resemblance, through beauty, through silence. The myth grew teeth. In 1801, nearly a decade after Elias's disappearance, an incident in Charleston reignited the coastal memory. A young free man of mixed heritage arrived at the docks seeking employment. His facial structure bore uncanny similarity to descriptions of Elias: sharp cheekbones, pale hazel eyes, composed demeanor. Within weeks, 3 households reported tension among their daughters after encountering him at market. Nothing scandalous occurred. No confirmed impropriety. but the memory of 17 ruined families hovered like a storm cloud. Two fathers confronted the young man publicly, accusing him of deception and manipulation without evidence. The confrontation escalated into a physical altercation that left one of the fathers injured. The young man fled the city, and Charleston's elite quietly agreed, "The curse has returned." What is striking is not that families fell again. It is that fear of falling caused them to fracture preemptively. The legend of Elias had evolved into a psychological weapon. It no longer required his presence. It required only resemblance. By 1805, pamphlets circulated anonymously in rural areas warning of the beautiful disruptor. These crude leaflets claimed that households must guard against charismatic outsiders who threatened moral order. Though Elias's name was not always printed, the story clearly traced back to the Whitmore and Mercer collapses. Children grew up hearing the cautionary tale. Wives were reminded subtly to avoid prolonged glances at strangers. Men were reminded that authority must be asserted quickly. The legend reinforced control. But control born of fear is brittle. The most devastating resurgence occurred in 1810 in a newly established plantation community west of Augusta. A prosperous landowner named Gideon Crowell had built his fortune rapidly through cotton expansion. He prided himself on rational thought and dismissed superstition openly. That is, until his eldest son fell into melancholy. The son, Henry Crowell, had recently returned from studying in the North. Unlike his father, Henry had seen cities, debates, shifting philosophies. He questioned inherited systems quietly. He spoke differently than his peers. Neighbors began whispering that Henry had been influenced by dangerous ideas. Someone, in a moment of cruel humor, compared him to Elias, saying he carried himself with the same unsettling calm. The comparison was meant as jest. But Gideon Crowell did not laugh. The old story surfaced in his mind, 17 families undone. He began watching his son with suspicion. He restricted Henry's travel. He intercepted his letters. He accused him of destabilizing the household. The more Gideon tightened control, the more Henry withdrew. Eventually, Henry left the estate entirely, relocating north permanently. The Crowell family name survived financially, but their unity did not. The legend of Elias had now destroyed a family without Elias ever stepping foot near them. The myth had matured. It had detached from the man. And that is when something even darker occurred. In 1812, during heightened tensions preceding the War of 1812, paranoia in Southern communities intensified. Outsiders were scrutinized. Strangers were monitored. Loyalty became an obsession. In one rural parish, 3 enslaved men were accused of mirroring the Mercer influence after refusing excessive punishment calmly rather than fearfully. They were labeled as carriers of Elias's defiance. The accusation led to brutal retaliation. None of the men had ever heard of Elias, but they suffered in his shadow. The 17th family's fall had ended a chapter. Now a broader cultural fracture had begun. What began as jealousy over beauty had transformed into generational anxiety about control. Elias's story was invoked whenever authority felt threatened. The irony is devastating. The man who never led an uprising became the symbolic face of rebellion. The man who rarely spoke became the embodiment of dangerous influence. The man sold, beaten, blamed, and exiled became immortal in rumor. And somewhere beyond county lines, perhaps alive, perhaps dead, he likely never knew the magnitude of the legend attached to him. By 1815, Mercer's estate had changed hands twice. The new owner reportedly ordered all old correspondence and account books burned, wanting no association with the infamous past. But fragments survived in personal letters stored privately by distant relatives. Those letters described something historians would later find chilling. They described regret. In one unsigned note believed to be from Abigail Mercer, she wrote that Elias had been the only honest man in a dishonest system. She suggested that her brother's death had more enemies than one enslaved worker. She implied that Pryor's brutality had sown the violence that followed. But the letter remained hidden for decades, because truth rarely spreads as quickly as fear. As the 19th century progressed, Elias's legend faded from mainstream discussion but remained embedded in folklore. Grandmothers warned granddaughters about charming strangers with Mercer eyes. Plantation owners warned sons that weakness invited collapse. 17 families had fallen originally, but countless smaller fractures followed in the wake of the myth. And then came the final twist. In 1823, a traveling preacher claimed to have met an elderly man in the Appalachian foothills who spoke softly of Charleston, of duels, of fires, of broken staircases. The preacher later wrote in his journal that the man's cheek bore a faint scar, the mark of a long-healed strike. The preacher asked the man his name. The man smiled but did not answer. No record confirms this encounter. It may have been embellishment. It may have been imagination. But the legend seized upon it eagerly, because people prefer stories that never end. The darker truth beneath the myth is this: Elias did not destroy 17 families. 17 families destroyed themselves confronting their own insecurity, jealousy, pride, and fear. But admitting that would require dismantling the illusion of superiority that upheld their world. So they created a villain beautiful enough to carry blame. And generations inherited that lie. By the time Elias's name became little more than a whispered cautionary tale, the South had already entrenched itself deeper into systems of control that would one day erupt into even greater national fracture. In a strange way, the story of Elias foreshadowed a broader truth. When a society fears reflection, it attacks the mirror. And Elias had been the clearest mirror they had ever seen. By the mid-19th century, the name Elias had nearly disappeared from official records. It did not appear in census rolls. It did not survive in estate inventories. It was not listed among fugitives, nor among the deceased. For a man blamed for the collapse of 17 families, his documented existence was almost ghost-like. All that remained were fragments, scattered letters, damaged account books, and inherited whispers passed from generation to generation. History often preserves conquerors. It rarely preserves scapegoats. The first serious attempt to examine the story critically did not occur until decades later, long after the original families had either faded into obscurity or rebuilt under different names. In 1857, a regional historian named Nathaniel Burke began compiling oral traditions of the Carolina backcountry. Burke was fascinated not by wars or politics, but by social collapses, families that rose rapidly and fell even faster. In his research, one pattern surfaced repeatedly: 17 households, connected loosely by trade and marriage in the late 1700s, all destabilized within a short span of years. At the center of every retelling stood the same figure: a beautiful enslaved man. Burke was skeptical of supernatural explanations. He had heard versions describing Elias as cursed, possessed, even demonic. But as he collected testimony from aging relatives and inherited correspondence, a more human story began to emerge. The Whitmore letters revealed financial overextension long before the Ashcroft scandal. Edmund Whitmore had invested heavily in speculative trade routes after the Revolutionary War, leaving his estate vulnerable. The Ashcroft patriarch had accumulated gambling debts months before Margaret's engagement dissolved. The Beaumont trade disputes had predated Clarissa's alleged fascination. The Harrington estate had been struggling with mismanaged crop cycles long before Daniel's temper flared. In every case, instability existed before Elias arrived. The legend had simply provided a focal point. Burke wrote privately in his journal that Elias was less a destroyer than a catalyst. He suggested that beauty in a rigid society exposes cracks more visibly than rebellion ever could. But Burke's research never reached widespread publication. Because the timing was inconvenient. The 1850s were not an era eager to examine the psychological fragility of plantation authority. Tensions between North and South were escalating. Public discourse hardened. The myth of infallible hierarchy was more important than ever. Revisiting a story in which powerful families collapsed under jealousy and paranoia threatened that myth. So Burke's findings remained largely unpublished, stored in private collections. Then came the Civil War. The war tore through the South with an intensity that dwarfed the quiet collapses of Elias's era. Plantations burned. Economies shattered. Families that had survived the earlier scandals were devastated by something far larger than rumor. In the aftermath, when records were scattered and estates abandoned, fragments of the old Mercer correspondence resurfaced. Among them was Abigail Mercer's letter, the one suggesting that Elias had been the only honest man in a dishonest structure. The letter circulated briefly among a small circle of post-war intellectuals attempting to understand how Southern society had constructed its own blind spots. But again, the narrative struggled to compete with larger national trauma. Elias remained a footnote, yet folklore endured where scholarship faltered. In rural communities, elders still told the story of the man whose face broke households. But over time, the moral shifted subtly. Where once he was described as a curse, later retellings framed him as a warning, not against beauty, but against pride. By the early 20th century, the tale had evolved further. In some communities, Elias became a tragic figure, insecurity in those who required visible submission to feel powerful. The families did not fall because he plotted. They fell because he existed in contradiction to their assumptions. Each collapse reveals more about the accusers than the accused. Margaret Ashcroft's rebellion exposed the transactional nature of arranged marriage. Clarissa Beaumont's scandal revealed the loneliness beneath social prestige. Thomas Harrington's paranoia revealed insecurity masked as authority. Daniel Mercer's aggression revealed immaturity disguised as strength. Jacob Pryor's brutality revealed fear masquerading as discipline. 17 families. 17 reflections. The mirror they tried to bury. And perhaps that is why Elias's name never vanished completely. Because societies remember their mirrors, even when they attempt to shatter them. Today, historians debate whether Elias truly existed exactly as described or whether multiple individuals were compressed into a single legend over time. Some argue that the number 17 may be symbolic, exaggerated through retelling. Others insist that estate records align too precisely to dismiss coincidence. But beyond the factual debate lies a deeper truth. The story endures because it speaks to something universal. When confronted with beauty, charisma, or quiet strength outside established power structures, insecure systems react defensively. They project danger onto difference. They interpret independence as threat. They punish reflection. Elias's legend is not confined to the 18th century. It repeats in different forms across eras. The scapegoat changes. The mechanism remains. Imagine the psychological burden he carried, if he understood even a fraction of what was unfolding around him. A man born into chains, blamed for collapses he did not engineer, beaten for fears he did not create, exiled to protect egos he never sought to challenge.